Good morning. I'm Linda and I head up the executive search practice at Prospectus, and we appoint talented leaders into purpose-driven organisations across a range of sectors. And we're the first UK's certified B Corporation of a recruitment agency, so meaning that we're a new kind of business, that we balance both purpose and profit. I also happen to be chair of our DEI committee. I'm governor at my son's school, and I'm very proud to be supporting the Welsh rugby team through the Six Nations currently, but perhaps more on that later, we'll see. So women's leadership is moving in the right direction, and last year we're incredibly proud that over 60% of our leadership appointments, so that's directors and chief executives, were women. But that's not evident in all sectors still. And I think sport historically has been a male-dominated pursuit, and perhaps like some other sectors, has been run largely by and for men. I think in recent years, we've been really pleased to see a shift in the visibility of women's sport, which is fantastic. Though unfortunately, I think stark gender inequalities still prevail. So joining me this morning, and we've got three amazing female leaders who have kindly agreed to join me quite early on in the day, but in support of International Women's Day. The theme this year is Choose to Challenge. And my hope for this conversation is that we inspire many more women to choose to challenge and to help forge a gender equal world. So if I hand over, it would be great to have each of you briefly introduce yourselves. Thank you. Stephanie.
Thank you. I was going to ask how we did that, which order. So I'm Stephanie Hilborne. I was recruited by Prospectus into my role as Chief Executive of Women in Sport, which is a charity that has existed to promote the opportunities for women and girls to play sport, but also to support women who work in sport, and has existed for 36 years. And I've been in the role just under a year and a half. And before that, I was 27 years in the environment voluntary sector. So it's a big shift for me, but it's really great to be in the sector.
Lovely, thank you. Tove.
Hi, I'm Tove Okunniwa. I'm the CEO of London Sport, which is an organisation that exists to get the good people of London to move more. We use sport and physical activity, not necessarily always sport, but just movement to improve people's lives and to have a positive impact on many of the social outcomes that are challenging us, not only at this time, but always. I'm also a board member of Sport England. I've been on the Sport England board for about 18 months now, and you may have seen over the last few weeks that Sport England now have a very exciting and ambitious new 10-year strategy, which again has moved them firmly into the realm of using sport and physical activity to help people to improve their lives.
Fantastic, goodness. Well, I personally know I need that more than ever after lockdown, so it's good to hear. Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mortiboys, and I'm the Managing Director for Dallaglio RugbyWorks. And I've worked alongside Linda and Prospectus for just over a year now. And at Dallaglio RugbyWorks, we work with the most disadvantaged young people who've become disengaged from their learning, and we use rugby and predominantly the power of sport really to re-engage them, to build their self-esteem and confidence so that they can go on to have positive and productive and actually really happy lives. So that's what we do at RugbyWorks. My background is sport and education. I am a PE teacher by trade, and moved through the education system and left teaching probably about 10 years ago now to go into the charity sector, and really value it and really enjoy it as a sector. We have a lot to contribute in terms of helping people have really good lives. And going on to have positive and productive lives. So yeah, that's my background.
I didn't know about that PE teacher piece.
Yeah, the PE I know.
Does it make you feel slightly scared, Linda?
Right now, very long time ago.
I bet you were a lovely PE teacher.
Oh,
So
great.
I wanted to start by sort of hearing some of your sort of thoughts and reflections. And I think many people believe that power and those with power are often very unlikely to share it or give it up unless there is an incentive. And I wondered if you agreed with that. And I guess, what would you suggest from your experience is a good influencing strategy? I think particularly within a male-dominated leadership. I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts and experiences on that.
I think you framed a very difficult question, so I don't want to go first.
I think you should though, Steph.
I mean, I think it's very interesting with any influencing that you need to win the case emotionally for somebody to really change. And if you do win it, you then need to have the information and the data and the facts to back that up, to perhaps help them to justify it to themselves and to others. So this sort of balance between the emotional case and the factual case is really interesting. And so you can present to a man leading a board or a company the facts about how the bottom line improves when there's women on the board and in the company, but that won't change their behavior unless they emotionally buy into the change. And I think we spend a lot of time in influencing circles just producing more and more and more facts, but that alone won't achieve the change. So I think because it's an emotional change you're seeking, your approach to it depends almost entirely on the circumstance and the person you're trying to influence. So it's not quite avoiding the question, but I do think that's my take on it.
I think that's a really interesting and sophisticated answer, to be honest. I think a lot of the time we have gone into this in a very factual way. I think that the combination of the two things is really where the power lies, and there's a push-pull of making sure that you are reading your audience and you can play to a personal agenda as well as a professional agenda. And I think that's where this idea of diverse leadership being much more productive, much more likely to bring you success, can play to the personal agendas of the people who are leading organizations where that is important to them. So I think that's a really important way of looking at it. But as Steph says, not leaving your EQ at the door and just battering with an argument. I think that's a really important thing. I think for me, what I've noticed over the years is the evolution of how much more willing and receptive a lot of people now are to diverse leadership and less threatened by it. So I think a lot of the time it's actually going that extra mile to find people who are really receptive, but just a little bit reticent about how to make this work in a way that feels authentic to them, particularly when there's been older generations who have grown up and operated in a particular environment where they feel comfortable for very, very many years, and then there's change coming, being live to the fact that that is uncomfortable for them, and actually how do you go into that, not compromising what is right and what is wrong, but helping people on that journey.
I would really agree with both of those points, actually. I think what I've experienced, especially working in a sport which is heavily male dominated at leadership level, and almost exclusively in rugby, I think what I've experienced is, and where I've had most success in terms of influencing and in terms of bringing those people with me, has been around the emotional side. So I can present as many facts as possible, and have done so, in terms of trying to influence, and have got, quite frankly, nowhere. And I think what I found is that through developing those relationships, through really getting under the skin of, and taking the time to do that, however irritating that might be, but taking the time to do that has led to the most success. And so that emotional journey, that buying in, that bringing them with you, I think is probably the most effective and powerful kind of arsenal in the toolbox, really, to be honest, from my experience.
And I think, I mean, it's a brilliant conversation to have, actually, but obviously we're usually trying to influence more than one person, aren't we? A group of people, a number of people. And the greatest power there is to find the people who are naturally with you and just empower them to sort of be true to themselves, because they've been sitting on what they're actually feeling. But in this territory of women's sport that we're talking about, in a way, we do find that the men who loved sport and then had daughters, not sons, are often very awake to this, because they see through or both daughters and sons, but they see through the lives of their daughters the things they didn't see happening. And I've asked a number of those men, when you were growing up, did you not notice that your sister suddenly couldn't play cricket or football or whatever? And they're going, no, to be fair, I didn't. Because you don't. When you're a kid, you just live in that moment. So I think there are some natural allies, and there are eye-opening moments for everyone, for all of us, aren't there? And so, when you talk about the definition of privilege, it's so you're not aware of it, isn't it? And so you have these eye-opening moments, and I think it's just us supporting that journey for that person.
And I think that level of authenticity as well, and being really actually honest about what the challenges are. Where I've had difficult conversations, it's been on the back of, do you know how difficult this is to get this through? Or do you understand where we're going with this? And having those authentic, direct, actually, conversations of, this is really difficult for us as an organisation because I'm being blocked. And that's not because we don't factually know what we're doing. It's just because we're navigating through a hierarchy that is challenging, and being just really honest about that and saying, look, it's still a challenge. We're still going to keep going and we're still going to keep working through. But this is tricky.
I think there's something also, just picking up on what Steph was saying about finding your allies. I think the non-profit grassroots sports, community sports sector, whatever you want to call it, is very different in different pockets. So the sport for good, really genuine grassroots sport angle, I've met huge amounts of women leaders within this, and it doesn't feel like the barriers are quite as marked in some other areas of sport, where it is very, very palpable almost, that there's a difficulty with gender, and quite frankly some other areas of inclusion as well. And I think if people are looking into the non-profit grassroots sport side of things, then there is much to be very optimistic about. We've got, even within the House of Sport, where we all have our offices, we've got a huge amount of female leaders, both in organisations that are dedicated towards promoting women's sport and across the piece. So I think that whilst there is still a huge amount of work to do, there are many people and many leaders who have grasped the nettle and are moving forward with this.
And can you tell me a little bit more about, how those women have achieved that? What has helped them to be able to tackle that gender inequality? We've talked about emotional intelligence and finding the right allies, but I wonder if we can dig a bit deeper, perhaps, to find out where those women, or where you have have found it to be most successful.
Without wanting to be, oh, sorry.
Okay.
I was going to say, without wanting to sound contrived, I genuinely think that playing sport when you're young helps you get through these life moments, not least team sport, because you basically train yourself to fail and pick yourself up again all the time, to take hits, but to carry on, you know, to not see it as your personal fault when something goes the way you didn't want it to go. And so, you know, that's partly why we're so passionate women in sport, that there should be more opportunities for girls to be playing team sport, which is the biggest gender gap, about a 20% gender gap, because you learn so many life skills from that. And if you look at the stats about women at the top, a very, very high proportion have played sport when they were young. Now, that may be simply because women at the top are more privileged, and more privileged women get access to sport, but you can't help thinking there's some connection there. And it's certainly why I ended up in this job, because I knew, being a woman in an environmental sector and taking on the heavy industries like the sort of the aggregates industry or the house builders or whatever, as a woman, was a sort of double whammy for the response you got. And I knew throughout it that I could only keep going because I've been trained to keep going almost, you know, through sport. So I think it's worth just reflecting on the amazing personal development that sport, and particularly team sport, but, you know, exercise sport, but team sport in particular brings you, and how we might be putting our women into the workplace at a disadvantage on yet another count if they've not had that opportunity.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think also taking that on to the next level is actually having an interest in sport and feeling comfortable within the environment of not only playing sport, but being a spectator and being a sport fan and being part of the discourse around sport. Certainly in my early days of being within the sport industry, I would routinely be the only woman in the room. And actually what I found I had to do was the fact that I was a marketing expert and that I had a track record in my professional discipline was less important than the fact that I could demonstrate that I was part of the tribe and I could talk about what had happened in the sport, you know, whichever sporting event it might have been over the weekend. I could demonstrate knowledge. I could take part in that, in the language of the tribe, and that made people calm and comfortable, that they could then start to say, oh, well, she appears to be one of us, and therefore we'll start to listen to her when she talks about her professional discipline. Straight, you know, irritating, as Sarah has said, that you have to go through this, and far from ideal, but one of those things that you think, well, what have we got in our toolbox? That was one of them, being known as an Aston Villa fan as opposed to a Man United fan, but being known as somebody that had had a season ticket when I was a kid bought me a huge amount of credibility in telling them how they should, you know, communicate about their brands, which had absolutely no bearing on that whatsoever.
I think it makes me smile because you're exactly right in that if I will watch every single Six Nations game, and I like rugby. It's all right. It's not my favorite sport, but I will make the effort and watch it, because then I know that actually I can talk with, having been a teacher as well, you know, I've taught most sports and therefore know the laws of the games and the rules, and probably in some cases know them better than my male colleagues, especially when you kind of drop into the conversation. Yeah, I used to teach first 15 rugby. So it buys you the credibility, it buys you traction, and all of a sudden you're right, you become, oh right, she knows what she's talking about because she knows what the dead ball zone is, and oh wow, that's really interesting, maybe she knows some other stuff, and it's astonishing to watch. I actually find it quite fun. I think for me as well, I've had some incredibly, I guess, powerful, I suppose, but definitely fundamentally strong relationships with with some really great people throughout my career. Like there's been almost kind of moments in time, you know, I could probably count on one hand the leaders that have really influenced me at really critical points as I've gone through my career. So when I decided to leave teaching, when I decided to come into the charity sector, you know, when I actually decided to retrain because I hadn't always been a teacher. So at those points, there were critical people that would become almost my go-to, and still are now. Those people are still, some of them are men, some of them are women, and they're still in my life as people that I would go to and call and say, what do you think about this? Or I'm thinking about this, taking this tack in terms of my leadership journey. What do you think? And really actually having the confidence to go and have those conversations, even if they're difficult ones, has really helped, has been, I would say, probably the most critical thing for me.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that comment about male allies is really important. If you look back at, when I look back at my career, it's only in retrospect you really see the way that things have happened, you know, as clearly as, you know. And there was one chap who was a really traditional sort of blokey finance director in the London Underground before he was a trustee for the Wildlife Trust, and he was amazing, you know, and he just loved seeing women who were talented achieving things. He just loved it, you know, and he'd be such a sort of bloke, but he just really supported me, and, you know, he really drove me and kind of inspired me, actually. So there are these people that sometimes the ones you least expect, who just actually are fascinated by people and love seeing talent, whether it's male or female, but then see female and they realize you're going to have more challenges, and they just really back you. It's interesting.
I think that's absolutely the same for me. I have a friend who talks about every leader needing cheerleaders, and having those people around you that are going to support your journey, are going to advocate for you, are going to, you know, move heaven and earth, as it were, to make sure that your story is there. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I have the exact same experience, and some of those leaders have been men, some of them are women. But I know that even now I will turn to, there's probably 4 or 5 people that I would refer to, and I know that they will support me, and they've come from all sort of angles of my life and all parts of my career. And I think that's really cool. I think it's important, and I think it's it's almost like, I think about it as almost having ground cover, having somebody who is looking out for you as you go forward. It's that sort of idea that you need people to watch your back while you're doing it, and to alert you to things that you should look for, or that you might be able to do to really that will lead you to success. I think it's an important thing. And also, I think as women, it's well, not just as women, but as leaders, but as women leaders, it's really important that we pay that back as well. So people
exactly.
For support. If, you know, I had recently somebody came to me for advice on whether they should go for a role, which it was clear to me, I hadn't worked with this person for quite a long time. She was well qualified, if not overqualified, for this role, and just needed a little bit of encouragement to put a foot forward and go for it. So I think there's that, and enormous amounts of mentoring programs, and give people a little bit more of that confidence that actually they're not alone and they can make that next step forward.
I think it's probably the biggest impact I've had in terms of supporting women have been indirect sometimes. So when, you know, I was working in a federal charity, some really nice, well-meaning men were chairing charities. And they'd say, I don't know why so-and-so, who was the obvious internal candidate, hasn't gone for the chief exec job. And I would say, have you asked her to go for it? Well, no, but obviously she'd go for it, wouldn't she? If she, you know, and it's like, no, you have to, don't you understand? She will not go for it if she's internal, if you have not indicated you want her to try. So, and about 3 women became chief execs this is in a charity context, so it's easy compared to some sectors. But it's that kind of taking that moment as well, I think, when you There's just literally a moment, you're talking to somebody, they're saying something like that, and it's recognizing that they're not seeing it, and it's helping them to see it. And it's, so for me, a lot of moments have been less prescribed where I've given support, they've been more reactive. But I think what's also interesting in this debate, Linda, I'm sorry, you might want to take it somewhere else, but it's slightly a generational thing, because I don't think there were, because the number of women in leadership positions in, you know, because I'm 50, nearly 53, in my parents' generation was almost non-existent, because they'd all been educated and then put back in the kitchen pretty well. You know, you couldn't look to the generation above. The ones who made it through had so many scars from going through the glass ceiling that they were quite hardened, and they were almost anti other women in some cases. It felt like that. It's probably not true, but it felt like, you know, my God, I've gone through hell, it's been easy for you kind of thing. And so often, you know, that generational thing's really big. And I think it's only now that I'm seeing around me, and, you know, slightly older than it, but not much, women being authentic women in leadership, rather than being hardened, armor on, tough, kind of pretend men in leadership. And so there's a big generational factor. And I think there's an interesting reflection on the next generation, whether they actually, what will happen with the next generation of women? Well, they think everything's equal, it's fine. I'll get there if I'm, you know, if I'm good enough. And almost we might slip backwards if we're not careful.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think, you know, I have, as I've got older, have reflected a lot on that, and especially, you know, coming into a very, like I say, a very male dominated sport. I think, you know, I am a woman, and I'm a woman in a leadership position, and I'm not going to almost apologize for that. It doesn't matter. I'm good at my job, and and that has resulted in me being in this position, irrespective of whether I'm a woman or not. Do I have a different perspective because I'm a woman? Yes, of course. And like, you know, like we were saying earlier, do I use different ways of working with people because I'm a woman? Yeah, I do. But that's because that's who I am. Not that's not something that I, you know, say, oh, actually I am, you know, I'm a woman in a leadership position and therefore I have to behave in a certain way. No, I just behave as who I am, and being authentic with that. And have done that a lot, I think, as I've got older. I think I was probably more of the, you know, as Stephanie was explaining, probably more kind of hardened when I was younger, especially in teaching, because especially going into leadership positions in teaching in very challenging schools, you know, you have to be really tough. But actually I've softened and become a lot more reflective as I've got older, and I've found that actually that makes me much better at my role.
I think the other element of this is thinking about women of colour, and I sort of would say this, wouldn't I? But actually within sport, within pretty much any area of life, the representation of women of colour, and certainly it is like this in leadership in sport, is markedly down from the representation within the population. And actually I think there's been a lot more focus on thinking about why that should be over the last year. I think it is tougher for women of colour to really feel like they belong in some of these roles, and to see sufficient role models of people who have gone before them that are doing this. So I think that there's a long way to go. There's more focus on it. Are we making real progress with this? Well, we'll see over the next sort of 18 months, I think, whether what happened last year has actually had some meaningful change starting to filter into the way that some organisations work and are prepared to nurture talent. But it's certainly something, I mean, the inclusion piece across sport in general is something that has gender representation has come a long way, and we will have seen things like the gender representation on boards has moved a huge amount over the past 4 years since the governance code was brought in. Other areas of inclusion are still on that journey to get to there, and I think, you know, we're at a crucial point now where we have to start seeing things in a nuanced way, and that it isn't like every woman is created equal. So I think that's a really big part of what we're talking about as well with this.
So describe to me a little bit more then, you know, what success could look like if we take that 10-year view. What could be the outcomes? What are the outcomes and the benefits for society if we get that right? Paint a picture for me.
If we get the whole picture right, I mean, Tove and I have talked a lot this last year about not just the gender diversity, but, you know, talking about every aspect of diversity and how you actually change that. What's the vision? I mean, the vision is that people in this country are equally represented in running it. And, you know, that is, and in some areas of sport, it's such a contrast, it's shocking. You know, I mean, if you look at athletics in particular, you've got enormous representation from the Black community and to a degree the Asian community in actually participating. As soon as it goes up the tree, you end up with an all white sort of governing body almost. And then you look at the gender, and so, you know, you have a large number of women. I mean, many more women than men are leading, running, you know, on the ground, you know, and basically there's quite a number of female coaches. When you get to the top, the elite coaches are nearly all men. There's only about 15% women. So in our ideal world, the people on the boards, in the executive, and the culture on the board and the culture in the executive, so it's not just the numbers, is far more reflective of either the whole country if it's national, or you know, a home nation, or a patch like London. So for Tove, obviously, the representation of the people of London is more diverse than anywhere else in England or the UK.
And I think building on that, that's absolutely right, is about the inclusivity of the cultures of the organisations that we're in. And I think that's where the change really needs to happen. So if you're going 10 years down the road, for anybody of whatever background to be able to show up to these organisations and to feel that they can thrive within those organisations, that they will be treated fairly and their representation and their career development will be equal within that organisation, I think is really what the 10-year vision would be. Because if you've got that right, if you've got the right culture, the right recruitment practices, the right ethos for people to actually exist together, the vision of what's okay around here within all of these organisations, then it will give a platform for people of all types of backgrounds to come through and to find a place there. So I think you have to start by looking inwards and looking at what your organisation is like for the people who work there, and what your own practices are like, in order to take that forward. And I think if, you know, nirvana is everybody doing that to equal measure. Now, of course, people are going to go at different speeds, but I think the laddering up of that being a really grassroots endeavour rather than a top-down endeavour, that people are taking responsibility within organisations for that change, is really going to ladder up to being something which is much more fundamental and at a population level.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, looking after an organisation that works with disadvantaged, disengaged young people, and using sport to re-engage them. The young people that we work with come from backgrounds where they just don't think they're good enough. And it's not anything more complicated than that. They just don't think they're good enough. They don't get access to the opportunities that they deserve, and actually, quite frankly, are entitled to, because of where they come from. And so for me, the kind of utopia is that starts from school. that starts really early on, as in you are good enough, you do have the skills, the expertise, and the aspiration to go on and be an absolutely phenomenal leader. And I mean, I would love it in RugbyWorks if we were working with a young person and they came in and they came and took my job. Absolutely, that have that real pathway to leadership that that enables them, supports them to become the best that they can be, and that actually is a given. It's not a unique story. It's not, you know, we tell the stories of our young people, and sometimes I get quite irritated by it, because I feel like, oh God, you know, not that it's not powerful, but the fact that I can't believe I'm having to tell this story to help you understand that these young people should be entitled to this. It shouldn't be unique. It should just be. And that, for me, it's that simple, I think. I mean, there is a journey to go on for sure, but it should be that simple. Everyone should have equal opportunity and equal right.
And I think coupled with that is incumbent on organisations having to fight harder and be really proactive about going out into communities where they haven't necessarily recruited, and telling those people that they are actively welcome within the organisations, and making the environment when they arrive there be genuinely that. But that first, you know, recruitment isn't just about putting an ad out there and seeing who comes. It's about really seeing who are you lacking within your organisations, and asking the question of what is it that you are doing as an organisation that is putting people off from applying. So it's not necessarily just down to their own view as to whether they can apply, or whether they should apply, or whether they've got the skills to do it. It's also about actually what's our employer brand? What are we saying to people, either overtly or subconsciously, about the type of people that we want to come and work here, and really challenging that? Because I think that's where a lot of organisations are subconsciously going out there with some fairly negative messages, and I think we have to think really proactively about that.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I think that's an inspiring call to action, I think, to finish on. It has been really inspiring to hear about your achievements. I hope it has helped to increase awareness of the challenge that many of us have faced or are facing, and that from really good challenge, emotional challenge, as well as thinking about the statistics and the benefits, you know, you can make a change. Any final comments before I let you get on with your busy days?
I think the most important change I've been making this last year is reaching out when we have jobs, well, making sure that we're describing what we're looking for and how our culture is really clearly, and then reaching out through networks that are not your normal networks to find people who might apply. So Tove's point about don't just sit back and wait. The only way to change is to be really deliberate about that change. So but that's not necessarily about specifically your original point about helping women get through the tree, but I think helping organizations is where we need to actually start. We shouldn't put the onus on every woman to be tougher by 10 than any man needs to be. The onus should be on the organizations to change.
And ourselves to be authentic.
Give us, yeah.
So thank you, Stephanie, Tove and Sarah. It's been a pleasure.